Okay, out here in the shop, we're going to do a General Motors S10 T5 transmission. We're going to do the Jeep input shaft swap. So you got your transmission, you know it's in good condition. You say, oh, I want to do that Jeep shaft swap so I can plug it into my old school Chevy clutch bell housing and don't need an adapter plate, and this is going to be great. So put your transmission in neutral. Make sure in your mind that the transmission is ready for service, and if not, have it opened and inspected, and then we can start this swap. Let's get started. Hey, we're out in the shop today, and I'm going to show you how to put a Jeep input shaft in an S10 T5 transmission. Now, this particular transmission is a good example. It has a Muncie bolt pattern. It has the 14 spline input shaft from the factory. This is a world-class transmission because it has a world-class input shaft bearing cup right there. And this will bolt onto an old school Chevy bell housing. What we're going to do is we're going to change out this 14 spline shaft. Yeah, it's been cut up on a little bit, but we're going to take this and exchange it for a Jeep shaft. So here's the Jeep shaft. Now, the Jeep shaft works because it has 21 gear teeth, just like that factory input shaft. But the reason it's nice is it has 10 splines on the input shaft, so that it'll match up with a 10 spline Chevy clutch disc. You're also going to need a brass synchro. Now, if it's a non-world class transmission T5, then it will already have a brass synchronizer with the notches that are small. These are small notches. You don't want the large notch. Now here's one I bought in the aftermarket. It's brand new. We're going to use this on this transmission. You're also going to need a input shaft bearing. So I bought a new Timken. Let's get started. So I took some bearing grease and I applied it liberally to the shaft where the bearing goes, and also to the inside diameter of the bearing. I'm going to take it over to the shop press now. I'm going to push that all the way down. I have the bearing pressed all the way onto the shaft. You can't see any daylight coming through between the gears and the bearing, so the gear teeth and the bearing, so that's on there, pressed all the way down. Good. Call attention to this carved out area that's at 12 o'clock on the on this. That's important. Okay, let's move on. We're now going to remove from the transmission the original input shaft. Inside of this shaft, right inside here, there will be 15 bearings. And when we remove this from the transmission, we don't want those bearings falling down inside the transmission case. It's difficult to retrieve them unless you open the case. I highly recommend that all of this be done with the case open, because why install a transmission unless you've inspected it and made sure it's, ready for service? And yet, I know some of you will. So, if you choose to just do the swap and not open up the transmission, I'm giving you instructions so that you can get the best possible walkthrough without opening it. But really you should consider it, because you're going to a lot of trouble to make the transmission run right with this Jeep shaft, and so it's worth your time. Okay, let's go over to the transmission. If you haven't done so, now would be a good time to drain the transmission. There are two plugs, the fill plug and the drain plug, and you can drain the transmission and put in new fluid after you're all done. Okay, this is a 13 millimeter bolt. Let's go ahead and take those out. I recommend not using an impact tool. Power tools and impact tools will tend to strip the aluminum threads that are in the case, and these are steel bolts, so the aluminum threads are going to give out if they take any abuse. So the 13 millimeter bolts are out. Notice I've marked this one up for future reference. This boss here is the rounded one. The one on the bottom has sort of a box shape, and that goes at the 6 o'clock position. So you might need a rubber mallet to work this thing loose. You're going to pull off the sleeve, the bearing retainer. Inside there is the race for the bearing. There's also a shim and also a rubber seal. The rubber seal can be easily replaced. They're only a few dollars. It's worthwhile doing. Make sure that the race does not fall out and roll all over the floor. You may damage it. Don't lose the shim that's under the race. We'll get to that in a few minutes. So now we have this input shaft, which has a bearing on it. And remember, I said inside this input shaft on the opposite side there are 15 bearings. Also remember that shaved off area that's cupped. Well, that area is important if you're going to remove this shaft without too much difficulty. Also, with this bearing retainer off, this input shaft tends to sag, and the way to get it to lift a little bit is to go to the opposite end and have someone push down with their thumbs on the output shaft, and that will cause a seesaw effect, and this end will rise up a little bit. That's important as you're trying to remove this shaft. So as we look in here, I'm going to look for that area that's carved away, and you see if I can show it to you on the video. That's the difficult part of doing this without having the case open. But you can turn it a little bit and you get a sense as to where it is, or maybe you can look in there with a flashlight. Let me try that. Okay, with a little extra light, I've lined up that carved out area. Now, it's right here at the 9 or 10 o'clock position. I want to roll it down so that it is even with these gear teeth, because that allows this to slide out and over top of those gear teeth for the counter shaft. So I'm going to turn it down there a little bit and wiggle, and I think it's going to require 2 hands. So using 2 hands, I'm going to put my other hand on the output shaft, and I'm going to push down, and you can see here how that tips this end up, and that's probably what you need to do to get this shaft free from the counter shaft and get it out. It takes 2 hands. Okay, I was able to get it free, and then I'm going to tip this down and hopefully find all 15 of those bearings inside. Now, one of the other tips I can give you is that when you're doing this, if you prop up the other end so that this transmission is literally tilted at an angle, that will work in your favor so that gravity keeps those bearings inside. All right, another look at this. You'll notice there's a thrust bearing here. And on the other side of that is the smooth surface of the inner surface of the input shaft. And then if you go in here, you'll see a synchronizer ring that has fallen down. Let's remove that. Oh, excuse me, that's the shim. That's the wavy shim. And there comes the synchronizer ring. Okay, they both want to come out. So again, this is a world-class transmission because of this bearing. I know it's a world-class. This wavy shim is unique to world-class. If you are working on a non-world-class, yours will not have the wavy shim. That's fine. And this is a fiber-lined synchronizer. If you look carefully at the inside diameter of this, you'll see it looks kind of like sandpaper. And those are fibers that help it grip. Notice the small notches. This is unique to world-class transmissions, the fiber lined. Okay, there's one or two more things. You'll see a round washer, and you will also find a race. This race is the other smooth surface that thrust bearing rides on. All right, we've now removed everything. Look here and here and here. You'll see 3 keys. Those are the keys that allow smooth movement of the slider. That's important. Hopefully you've watched this video at least once before you started your project. Should have mentioned it earlier. I'll probably put it in the beginning of the video, but your transmission must be in neutral for all of these procedures so that you're not fighting against gears that won't turn or want to turn all simultaneously. Okay, we've taken out all of the things we need to do our Jeep shaft swap on a world-class transmission. Now, the small parts kits for these T5 transmissions will have brand new bearings. They're pretty cheap. The package comes with 16 bearings. Yeah, you only need 15, so don't let that number 16 bearing freak you out like you're supposed to figure out what to do with it. You only need 15. You put them in there with some bearing grease to make them stick so they don't fall out. Okay, so we just did that. Great. Now we're going to put some grease on our thrust bearing, and we're going to reassemble this. So you may ask yourself, well, why can't I just use the fiber line synchronizer over again? Why do I have to buy a brass synchro for the Jeep shaft swap? Well, the reason is that fiber lined synchronizer has a smaller diameter than the brass one, and it will not fit over top of this Jeep shaft. So you know, you're not going to be able to reuse that. You can just save it, put it in a drawer, whatever. If you have a non-world class transmission, of course, you can use the synchronizer that was on the input shaft and just transfer it over to this one, because they will be identical and the correct one. So it has to have the small notch. Let's put it together. Now, it's always nice to make sure your parts fit together like you think. So I put this synchronizer on here as it's going to be, and sure enough, it looks just fine. If the synchronizer teeth, these little dog houses on the end of there, if they look all battered up, then you might as well just get a new synchronizer ring, because again, you want this thing to work right for you. So these little dog houses here and here are important. Okay, so that fits, but we're not going to install it on the shaft. We're going to install it on the transmission. So we're looking inside the transmission. Nothing has been replaced. Notice the synchro keys are at approximately 10 and 2 o'clock, and I think the other one's down here at 6 o'clock. I'm going to take some bearing grease and I'm going to wipe it on this smooth surface. That's to help the thrust bearing race to stick on there, and then I'll go ahead and put that on, and that sticks. Good. Now I'm going to put some grease on my synchronizer so that it sticks to this slider. This is the slider, and I'm going to apply grease liberally because I don't want the synchronizer to fall off of the slider while I'm installing the input shaft. So there I have lots of grease on the synchro ring. We're going to replace the special washer back on here. Don't let that fall inside the transmission. That sort of butts up against the ends of those bearings, that are 15 bearings that are inside the input shaft. All right, so these small notches on here are going to line up with those keys. So you put it in here, You wiggle it around and you make sure that it clicks in place and lines up with those keys. You'll feel it sort of click into place. When it's properly in place, it will not spin. It will pivot left and right, but it will not spin freely. You'll feel it stop one way, go the other way, it stops again. That's because it's bumping into the keys. You can take your fingers off because you have lots of grease on there holding it in place. Okay, time to install the input shaft. Now, we're going to use that trick again where you put your other hand on this end of the transmission and push down on the shaft. That raises this end of the shaft up in a seesaw motion, allowing easier placement of the input shaft. So this notched out area that's where my thumb is there has to line up with the counter shaft here, and that allows it to slide into place. So I'm going to turn that down to the 7 o'clock position. I'm going to put my thumb on the other end of the shaft, push down, and that will raise things on this end so that this can slide into place. What we're looking for is it to slide in and push firmly up against the synchro ring without the synchro ring falling off, because then you have to start all over again. Well, there it is. You didn't get to see live action of me putting it in, but I slid that in. Now you'll notice how the bearing is really sticking about halfway out and halfway in past the face of the case. So that's how you know. And then, of course, you can twist and things don't rattle around, you're in good shape. So inside the bearing retainer is a seal. It's important that seal's in good condition. If not, please replace it. They're pretty cheap. This has a shim. Actually, that was an extra shim. So this is the shim that came out. It goes back in. This is the new race. Make sure it's wet so that it's got a little bit of slipperiness to it. It goes back in. It's important that you have reinstallation with the small notch to the top at 12 o'clock so that fluid can run inside that notch and down into the bearing section so your bearings don't dry out. If you have this or any other section at the top, there's no place for the fluid to get down inside, and fluid doesn't run uphill too often. So you put the new race in, make sure your seal is in good shape, replace the shim, and now we're ready to install it, but we make sure this is perfectly clean. This groove in here where the two surfaces meet should be perfectly clean because that's where the RTV is going to go. But you're not going to use any RTV just yet. So now we come over here, and you'll notice that I'm now using a different input shaft, bearing retainer, and that's explained because somebody had this one, cut it short, and this is for a customer, so I'm going to let the customer determine the length. He's going to trim this back, but I'm not sure how much he wants to trim it. Okay, we're not using any RTV for this first trial installation because we want to just test fit and check for end play. I've tightened down these bolts. I will comment that this bearing retainer should go flush with the case without needing to use the bolts to draw it up to the case. It is not something that has to be pulled in there by tightening the bolts. In fact, if you find that it doesn't want to go flush, you've got something misaligned in there. It's not fitting right. Okay, so now it's on there snug. I would never use a impact or power tool to do this. I'd do it with hand tools. You want to get it snug, really tight. Tight is good. Really tight or gorilla tight is bad. You'll strip the threads most likely. Now we're going to tug on this end and see how much end play we have. You should not feel or hear any end play, and I feel some, so that means to me that it could use a thicker shim or two shims. You want zero end play, and here's why. You don't have any RTV in there. Well, RTV takes up some space. It is not infinitely thin. It does have some thickness to it when it's sealed up in there, so that will add just a little bit of additional distance between the race and the bearing. So I'm going to add another shim in here and get zero end play. And don't worry about side-to-side wobble. Side-to-side wobble does not matter. The other thing is we're going to eventually trim this back to the proper length so that you are duplicating the distance from the front of the case to the end of the sleeve so that it matches your old transmission. I'll comment on the next section what that distance actually is in most Chevy applications from the 60s and 70s and 80s. For most old school Chevy applications that use a Muncie bolt pattern, say a small block Chevy or an inline 6-cylinder Chevrolet engine, you're going to have from the front of the case to where you cut approximately 3 1/4 inches, out from here, and then draw a line. So that line is 3 1/4 inches from the face of the transmission. And then also the length of the shaft will need to be trimmed, and that's usually 6 5/8 from the face of the transmission. And that way it can bolt up to the bell without a spacer. If you're using a spacer, those dimensions are going to change by the thickness of the spacer added to the dimensions I just mentioned. 3 1/4 plus the thickness of the spacer would be where you would cut this. And then the tip would be cut 6 5/8 plus the thickness of the spacer, and you would trim the tip. So this tip will need to be trimmed. This will need to be trimmed by the customer. But I'm not going to do it for him, because if I do it wrong, it's going to come back to me. But I'm going to show you what we're going to do here. Now that we've figured out that this needs another shim to get the end play to go away, we are going to add that shim and bolt it up. When you are ready to put this on for the final time, you're going to put some RTV in this groove here. Make sure it's spotlessly clean. Just a thin smear of RTV in this groove, and you're going to bring a little bit of it out and around these bolt holes, because these bolt holes do enter the case, and if transmission fluid wants to weep out through there, it would find its way out. So surround the bolt holes and the area where these two places interface. The last thing is make sure you wet your bearing with some RTV. It should have a little bit of grease on it from the factory when it was made, but it never hurts to have the bearing wet with RTV before you put this transmission into service. That can always be accomplished by adding RTV to the transmission after it's assembled, and then sort of rolling it around to let the RTV inside get on all of the bearing surfaces. That's another way of doing it. All right, so we're going to put this together. So I added too much shim. How do I know? Well, I can't turn this anymore. It won't turn, so I have the bearings so tight that it won't turn. I have to get a thinner shim. Okay, there we go. I got a second shim that was thinner than the first one there, and now I'm good. So I have two shims, the original and a thin one, not two thicker ones. And I can turn this, and I have zero end play. That's just here by feel. This is at the top. Now, if you are my customer, you're going to make some measurements and cut here and cut here. If you are doing this at home and watching this video, then you're going to wonder, well, how am I going to figure out where to cut it? And I'll show you. If you're using your original transmission as a reference, you're going to measure and duplicate that. Unless you've changed something drastically, you're just basically plugging in a different transmission into your current setup, and you want it to work pretty much the same. So in my circumstances, I would want 3¼ inches. So I'm going to mark the shaft sleeve, the bearing retainer sleeve right there where the square meets it at 3¼ inches. So carefully matching my General Motors transmission, I am able to determine 3¼ inches to this line from the face of the transmission, and to this line 6 5/8, and that would duplicate say a Muncie 4-speed or a old school standard 3-speed. That should work. Now, other transmission applications may be different, so if you're doing Mustang or some other version, don't use these measurements. In fact, you just need to determine your own. After making these measurements, checking them twice, checking them 3 times, you're going to remove this, trim it back. You're going to leave this in place, cover this with a rag, trim the tip off. Notice how the end of this is sort of chamfered, so you're going to do that to the end of that. You can always cut things a little shorter if you need to, but you can't cut them longer, so make sure you cut, measure first and then cut. That's the Jeep shaft swap. If I cut here and here and have this sealed in there correctly, this transmission would be ready for service as soon as I filled it with ATF. And you can fill it by simply taking off the shifter box cover and the shifter stem and so forth, and adding ATF that way. Use Dex Merc ATF for the best shifting transmission fluid, in my opinion. You should not use transmission oil or gear oil, especially not in a world class with the fiber synchros. So yes, this has a brass synchro for 4th gear. 3rd, 2nd, and 1st are the fiber line synchros, but guess what? Even in the world class, the 5th gear synchro is brass. So you're really just using different technology, and this is going to drive and run just great. I've seen many people do this. I've done several myself. This is for your learning information. And then, just to be very clear, this swap is identical, except for a very few minor things, if this was a non-world class with all brass synchros. The differences are you don't have the wavy shim in there. You won't find it, you won't see it. The difference is you'll use the same synchronizer ring, the brass ring that came out of it for 4th gear, goes right back in, or unless you buy a new one, it has to be the small notch. And otherwise, this is the same. So I wish you all the success, and if you have questions, you can contact me. My website is lugnuts65chevystepside.weebly.com.